Welcome to Frontline Conversations. Today I'm here with filmmaker and writer Paromita Vohra. She's also fondly known as Bombay Rosie. She founded Agents of Ishq, an online platform for positively representing sex in India through various media forms. After almost 15 years, she's back with a new documentary, Working Girls. Working Girls uncovers the invisible labor of women across India, from domestic workers to dancers, sex workers to mothers, farmers to surrogates. Welcome to Frontline Conversations, Paramita. So just to get started, I'll just dive right into the questions. Working Girls is based on research by the Laws of Social Reproduction project. How did the Laws of Social Reproduction project shape Working Girls? What was the process of converting this research into a documentary?
So the Laws of Social Reproduction is a project that looked at women in these 5 sectors that are also present in the film. That is erotic dancing, sex work, domestic work, unpaid domestic work, and paid domestic work, as well as egg donors and surrogates. So the film also looked at those sectors, and I think there was a certain amount of research that the project had also done, quantitative and qualitative interviews with people, with organizations and collectives. So I think at the beginning, we engaged with some of those organizations and people as well while researching the film. Some of the same people are in the film, for instance. But I think what the project, for the Laws of Social Reproduction project, really gave was this very strong framework of these 5 sectors and the interrelationship between these sectors and how law actually defines women's rights, possibilities, what is recognized as work, not recognized as work. So I think this framework was the thing that at least I engaged with the most, and where research is concerned, because the needs of a film are sometimes a bit different than the needs of a written project or an academic project. So at the starting point, of course, there were all these relationships with these organizations that the project already had. And that was also a starting point for me. And there are some overlaps there. Obviously, your thinking also goes in certain directions. You become interested in certain things. So I added the Asha workers component to the film, which isn't necessarily part of what the project is doing, but it's clearly linked also to the thematics of the project. And other than working or interacting and engaging with the research of the project, there were also conversations. For example, the project also had these book talks every month that I used to attend. So there was also a way of thinking about these themes from various angles while listening to people whose research overlapped with these ideas, even if the topics per se were not the same as what the project was researching. So yeah, I think it was like a rich year and a half of thinking alongside the project and working on the film while doing that.
The documentary, it covers a lot of women's lives, and it covers a lot of places. You go from Madurai to Mumbai to Kolkata and Shillong, and those are just a few places to name. But you've mentioned you worked on it for a year and a half, and there was a lot of footage, I'm sure, that didn't make it to the final cut of the film. So how did you decide which portions you were going to keep, which portions were going to get cut out, and were there any challenges you faced in trying to weave all of these different narratives together?
The thing that you described, how to decide what to keep and what not to keep in a film, that is the process of filmmaking, actually. No two filmmakers will make the same film, even on the same people or the same subject matter. So it's always a matter of where your eye is drawn, what interests you. Even when you look at like this subject matter of the project itself is so vast. So even taking some decisions about where to go for each theme and whom to interview is already a process of selection. And I think it's very important to remember that all works that we create are a process of selection, and they're determined by the perspectives of the people who are making that work, right? But that said, I think in a film, you do begin with a broad canvas. And then as time goes by, as you do research, as you talk to different people, it starts to, there are always some questions that the filmmaker has in mind. The filmmaker has their own set of interests that start getting answered in the process of the research, right? So I think for me, I was very, very interested to make a film that would shift our gaze towards these professions and how we define work and what is our notion of women who are often in marginalized spaces. Because a film I think can be a very powerful way of changing how we think about the world. I don't think that it is an ideal medium for listing a lot of facts, for instance, but it is a great medium for making us feel things, for making us know another person's inner life to some extent. And I think that especially when you're doing work on a subject like labor, there are some very standardized ways in which people talk about these issues. And I think that what I discovered while researching the film and while shooting it is that actually there's an incredible world full of people who are making their own lives against great adversity, who are actually also articulating a political view of the world, who are expressing how they understand their lives and how they understand social structures. And there is a great need for all of us to simply listen to this other insight and to learn from that insight, right? So the idea is not that you go out and you find people whom you will neatly fit into some predetermined frame. Rather, the framework that you use when you start is just a doorway. And the framework allows you to step into another world from a certain direction. And after that, you have to try to be a little bit open to whatever is revealed to you. You don't shut out what is revealed to you because it doesn't neatly fit into something. So that is also how the idea of the ASHA workers entered the film. Because as I was working on the film, I thought, oh, all the themes that the project is talking about, in some ways, they come together in this figure of the ASHA worker, which is the idea of the mother, the idea of care being a natural duty of women, that which should not be paid money, but should only get an honorarium. These ideas are institutionalized in a very clear way in the ASHA worker. So I should also talk to ASHA workers, and I should also cover the ASHA workers strike. So I think that this discovery of people and how they articulate their own world was something that I very much wanted to frame in the film, if I could, allow people to make us see these themes from their point of view, and to form our understanding from their own experiences. Because I think that very often we also make up our minds about people's realities on the basis of statistics and data. And I believe that statistics and data are very important for us to understand systemic things, because they also determine policy and so on and so forth. They're very important. But as an everyday person, I think it's very important to remember that there are many points of view in the world, and it is not for us to determine the meaning of somebody else's reality, that people do have an understanding of their own reality. So how could the film best try to be formed by how people see their own realities? So that is why one of the things is that the film spends a lot of time with people. Like, if I were to describe the film, I would really say it's just time spent with women who do different kinds of work, just following them at their work and having conversations with them while they cook, or to talk to them about their work, but also other things in their life. And I think after that, once all that material was gathered, while editing, I think the first thing is, of course, the structure of a film and what should come first, what should come second, so on and so forth. And that really is something you do intuitively, because you do many different drafts of a film. Like a documentary film goes through endless versions and endless structures. But to a great extent, you do it from your gut. It's not always logical. Sometimes you structure a film logically, that this leads to this and that leads to that. But somehow, when you watch it, it doesn't give you that feeling of a flow. So you actually, in the end, the decision about what to have in the film and what to not have in the film was really determined by what makes you just feel like you are part of this day of the person's life. How can you just enter that day? And so the film didn't then get bogged down with having to tell you every single thing about the particular issue. And then there was this whole thing about the history of law, and how so many laws which we don't really question are rooted in attitude, right? We have an impression that laws are the automatic route to rights. And yes, sometimes laws do give us rights, but there are sometimes that laws also don't, or they prevent us from accessing our rights, because laws are made by people, and people come with their own baggage, prejudices, and lack of understanding. In a way, one hopes that when people see this film or read the reports that the Laws of Social Reproduction project is bringing out, they will listen to the experiences of those people and allow their understanding of what policies and rights and laws should be framed to benefit people from the perspective of those people and not from our perspective of what's good for others or what's the good thing to do. So I think that this history of law, which is so often the history of morality rather than the history of rights, is something also that the film, reading a lot of history books, was condensed into these little animated sections. So I think eventually the interweave of the film was that people should be able to watch and understand why people's lives are shaped, how people's lives are shaped by law, and that you should be absolutely open-hearted while watching the film to the experiences of others and learn from them rather than try to fit them into your pre-existing learning.
Like you were saying, you used a lot of animation works and you were basically trying to keep the film sort of engaging to the audience and not fitting it into certain boxes that they already had. So you used humor and you used a lot of like music, which was quite different from what traditional documentaries would have. How did you decide on these kind of techniques and connect it with the women's experiences? What guides your tone and pacing when it comes to documentary making on such subjects?
So the thing which you're calling a traditional documentary, is rooted in a certain mindset, which believes that documentaries have a higher purpose than fiction films, which are supposed to involve your emotions, and documentaries are somehow about nobility, and that there should be no pleasure in a documentary. Like having fun while watching a serious topic is somehow taboo, and it makes you less serious. Right? But I really don't believe in this. I believe this is a very kind of Brahminical attitude to thinking about politics. And I think if you see, the film is quite funny, but a lot of the humor comes from the people themselves. It's not that I'm imposing the humor on the film, right? I am myself a person who loves humor. And so whatever I am as a person, I'm not going to keep it away from the film. Film is being made by a person, and the more personality a film has, I think the less it tries to act as if it knows everything. If you have a sense that some individual has made this film, then you will see it as in a certain place. You won't put it on a pedestal, and that's very important, right? I don't want to be on a pedestal lecturing others. I want to make a film that engages people and that makes them interact with the film. See, if you interact with the film, that means you have to interact with your whole being. You can't interact with only half of yourself. So only intellectually interacting with a film, but not laughing or feeling emotional, or some people cried in some parts of the film, but feeling moved, feeling involved, feeling interested in what the person said. You have to interact with the film. When you interact with the film, that means you're really interacting with the words of the people in the film. And then you are trying to think. It's a more equal kind of a gaze. So I think that humor, music, enjoyment, pleasure, these are inclusive things, and they bring an audience together. And you engage with people not as specimens or examples of something, but simply as people, and learn from their lives. So the animation and many other elements of the film, these are things that I have worked with stylistically in my other work as well. All my other films have quite a lot of graphical elements, and music is very important to me. So I've always been lucky to have really good composers for all my films. And I think also that, see, the division of the documentary and the fiction film, it's a false division, right? Whether it's a fiction film or a documentary, all films are merely engaging with the world around us through different forms. So I think that there is no need to be so orthodox and make a documentary the way somebody else told you it's supposed to make. Film is a malleable medium. Art exists for us to make it in many which ways. So the orthodoxy that you can only make a film in one format, and only then it should be taken seriously, I find this a Brahminical approach. Unfortunately, especially when it comes to documentaries, this is very hard and fast. And it's a very sad thing that also the media or people writing about films don't engage with documentaries as films. They engage with documentaries as some kind of a slightly high-minded reportage on something else. But the work of reportage is different and important in its own place, and the work of documentaries is different. And it can be, very heterogeneous, actually. So sadly, because we don't engage with documentaries in that way, we lose the pleasures that the documentary can give us. And we're not able to make films that people can really locally connect to. So you're very much made dependent on the foreign film festival circuit. And then those documentaries have to look a certain way, which is just like the film shows you how laws are generated by mindsets, right? There's a colonial gaze that's moralistic and it determines laws about dance or about love. Similarly, the idea of how a documentary film should be made, there is no hard and fast, but there is a kind of format that has been handed down by a very westernized kind of filmmaking. And I think because all the money comes from the West and it's always in the film festival space, you are supposed to make a documentary that looks like that, and only then will it get taken seriously. And unfortunately, only when it gets taken seriously by some film festival in another country and maybe wins a prize, then maybe the media will take it seriously. Otherwise, nobody really engages with documentaries in India. So I definitely, as a filmmaker, would like that to break. And I would like people to love the films and take them for themselves. I want to make films that people in India love and watch and learn from, and which are part of their larger cultural experience. And that is why I make the films as if they are films that people want to watch, not films which are going to improve people, but will do what all art does to people, which is change the way we feel. So that's one thing. But I also do believe that, when you go and you ask somebody to share a bit of their reality with you, what is it that you can bring? That person is telling you about their lives and that person is sharing their insights with you. What the hell are you doing as a filmmaker over there, right? You have to make the film and you have to bring some value to the film. And the value that you bring is not like, oh, I'm so great because I took my camera and I went to Madurai and I shot. That's no big deal. I mean, that's the bare minimum. That's the job description. You have to go and do it. So that doesn't make you special. Actually, it is what you bring as a filmmaker that adds value to the conversation. So I would like to make the film as well as I can so that we relate to the subject matter of the film the way we relate to everything else. And I do believe that after so many years of working, this is something that makes a difference to audiences. It encourages audiences to relate to the world of the film. And it allows audiences to feel challenged, but not guilted. When you're just there to guilt people and tell them you're so bad, people don't change. I mean, they all nod their heads and say, yeah, we're so bad. And that's the end of it. But when you watch a film and you are engaged with it and you've interacted with it and it goes into you, it seeps into your soul, then I think it changes the way you are. And it invites you to think of how you will do your work differently or how you will live your life differently. And that is why the films that I make are full of so many filmic elements of the kind that make us love watching films.
That makes a lot of sense. Yeah, that's very beautiful, actually.
Thank you.
And like your own techniques in the film, and because of the way you probably do interact with the people who you're filming, many of your works have women at the center, but they don't fall into this ideal victim trope. And even in Working Girls, we see that all of these women redefine what the notion of agency is, according to what society thinks agency for women looks like. How important is it to challenge these kind of dominant narratives?
So I would say that, I'm not very interested in the dominant narrative, by which I mean that I'm not interested in its dominance. Very often we say these things, I'm going to smash the patriarchy and I'm going to challenge the dominant narrative. But the more we do that, the more importance we give the dominant narrative, right? So the dominant narrative is not a factor for me when I'm going out to make them. I'm not there to engage with the dominant narrative. You can find the dominant narrative every day, no? When you open the internet, when you scroll Instagram, when you open the newspaper, but hey, there's lots of dominant narrative around. So I don't really want to spend another minute thinking about it. When you go out to make a film, you have the chance to learn something new. So really, that's all that I'm doing. What will I discover and what will we discover as an audience by talking to people? And when you don't carry the dominant narrative with you, you don't position the people that you're filming with vis-a-vis the dominant narrative. What makes somebody marginalized? That you always think of them vis-a-vis the dominant narrative. But what if you remove the dominant narrative from the picture altogether? What if you just go without that in your mind and talk to people? Then the dominant narrative becomes irrelevant. And that is what I would like to do. I'm not interested in challenging it. It is irrelevant, and I would like to make it even more irrelevant. There are many other narratives in this world. There are not only two. dominant versus marginal. There are 100 narratives. And I think that if you can go out and discover them, that gives you a lot of possibility for thinking about change in different ways, right? It will prevent us from thinking that there's a magic bullet for change. See, the idea is that, now we'll give everybody technology, then everything will become okay. And then, or we'll do X, Y, Z for everybody and it will become okay. But the real thing you learn about social change is that it's very context dependent. There are many contexts. And unless you learn to understand a context, you can't really work with others to devise something that could change that context. How do you do that? You do that just by understanding context. So in a sense, you go out and you try to understand a context. That is why every person that you see in the film, one of the reasons why we decided that there would be each topic of the film, like each sector, say erotic dance or domestic work or sex work, that each would be in one location. So in a way, that location gives you kind of context. You come to know the place, you come to know the people, you come to know the history, and you come to understand that sector of work through that context. It's a very contextual understanding. So it stops the film from being the be all and end all, right? The film is part of a larger project. There's a lot of research in that project. So another thing is that the film is working in tandem with that research, right? Like, it is the hope that people will go and read about the project. They will look at the data that the project is generating. They will read the reports. They will read the books and papers that have emerged from it through various scholars' work, right? So actually, that's really how I feel you can shift the gaze. You can shift the gaze by just centering other things. And the way in which you center somebody is not by saying, now I'm going to center you. The moment you do that, you have marginalized the other person, right? Because you're deciding what the center is, where somebody should be. Rather, if you decenter your thinking, and you say, okay, like, now I don't know, I'm going to learn this new thing, I'm going to understand this from the other person, then I think that I feel one of the most powerful political qualities any human being can have, whether in their own life or whether in their work or whether in thinking about social change, is curiosity. If you are curious about others, if you want to know about how they think about the world, if you do not have too many preconceived notions, we all have some preconceived notions, right? But if you try to go out there just curious and try to know people and their lives, but not intrusively, it is also another very bad habit of documentaries, traditional documentaries, as you call them, of feeling that you must extract as much intimacy as you can with the person. But I genuinely feel that, I work with this idea of fleeting intimacy, that when we meet, we have a conversation that is equal in intimacy to whatever the subject grants, right? If they are willing to let me shoot in their house cooking, then great. If they say, no, you can only shoot me in the office, then that's where we will shoot them. But that doesn't mean that there will not be an intimate conversation, because intimacy is not just about spilling your guts. It's also about sharing your ideas, which people do in the film, right? So I think that this curiosity goes a long way in helping us to have a multiplicity of narratives.
But Working Girls shows how domestic and reproductive laws can be selective. You talk about like domestic work, and you also talk about things like surrogacy. So one thing is invisibilized completely, but it's not paid, and another thing is profit-oriented industry now. Both of them are exploitative in their own ways, however. So, do you think these laws show a divide between moral and marketable women's work? What are your thoughts on that?
I think that one of the things we do learn, both from the Laws of Social Reproduction projects research, as well as what we see in the film, and the histories of law that we see in the film, is that, yes, whom the law chooses to see and not see, what is made legal and not made legal, is a kind of validational instrument, right? It validates certain things, and that means it invalidates other things. But really, the connection that we see is what are the things that the law feels uneasy recognizing. And these are, very simply put, certain tasks that women are naturally supposed to perform within marriage. That if they perform them outside marriage and charge money for it, then it suddenly becomes bad. But when those same things are done within marriage, they become noble. right? So in both of these ways of looking at women's work, you actually make women vulnerable. When a woman is expected to perform so many labors, and they're called divine labors, then her choice of performing that labor within the matrimonial framework gets completely elided. And she is subject potentially to certain forms of exploitation within that patriarchal context. Because you're saying it's not work, it's the natural duty that you have to perform. And it's so undefined and it's so infinite, I mean, when you call it divine and then you say woman is a devi, you're saying she can do everything, which means you want her to do everything, right? So she cannot decide. If she's going to decide not to do everything, then she is not a real woman, so to speak. On the other hand, when she is charging money for those things and you say it's bad, you stigmatize it. You invisibilize it by taking it outside of law. Or you use laws that are moralistic to control it and say you are saving women without taking into account their consent, what they feel should happen for them. And moreover, when you live in a larger market context, which doesn't provide care for all citizens, which doesn't provide any social cover for people, like there's no insurance, there's no good healthcare system, there isn't free education, and there's such a large number of people struggling economically in this society, then you make those people precarious, right? Because those spaces are unregulated. Those works are still happening. There is still, so to say, a market for those things, and people are participating in that labor market. But because that labor market is not recognized and not regulated, they are not able to have rights within it. And because of that, they are open to exploitation at various levels. So I think it is a question of the gaze on what a woman is supposed to be. And for that matter, who is supposed to be a woman, that too, that determines what women's rights really are. So, and connected to this, the conversation on women's rights, it always seems to pertain to a very, very small segment of women. What kind of woman is worthy of having rights? And what kind of woman doesn't have rights but can only be a victim? One of the people in the film, and this is not in the film, it's one of the many things we had to leave out of the fantastic things women said, but Tejasvi Sevakari, who is part of the sex workers collective in Pune, Sahiri-san, she said this in her interview, right? That you decide you're the savior and the other person is the victim. And once she's a victim, you don't have to give her any rights. You just have to save her. So this little kind of like a nice sleight of hand that happens where a victim does not need rights, but a victim only needs saving. And that when we speak of women's rights, we do it in a very narrow kind of window of what kind of person can access those rights. And very often that's a person who already has a certain social and economic access, which allows them to access more. So that tells you that if people have more social and economic access, they will be able to access more rights. So you should give more people rights and more people social and economic access.
Something interesting that I also noticed was that the title Working Girls resembles an earlier film that you've done, Unlimited Girls. Is there a connection between the two titles? How did you choose the title for this film? Because you could have also said Working Woman, but then you choose Working Girls. Is there a specific way that you came about choosing?
So, I mean, if a film is called Working Women, will you go and see it? Probably not. If a film is called Working Girls, it calls up a certain image, right? Like right. The idea of girlishness is not to infantilize, but it calls up a certain idea of carefreeness and of a certain wish to be out in the world, right? So this figure of the working girl in popular culture is someone who wants to be carefree. And because the film is also about care work, in a sense, I felt that this kind of carefree image that it calls up, and the idea of like a woman going about her work, catching the train, catching the bus, going to work. So it creates an image that already is not boxing up people, right? It's a popular cultural image rather than a category. Working woman is a category. Working girl is a kind of image. So that is why that's what the film is called. And in a sense, it's a very literal title because the film is about a lot of different kinds of working girls. And yes, I did partly think of this title because I had made an earlier film called Unlimited Girls. And when I made Unlimited Girls, it was 2002. And we were just 10 years into economic liberalization. A lot had changed. The internet was coming in. There were a lot of new freedoms that women were exploring, more women were joining the workforce, more women were living on their own because people were accessing the internet. There were different kinds of sexual freedoms arising. But a lot of these questions were not really already in the feminist discourse in India at that time. There was a very strong discourse around law and rights, economic disparity, dowry, rape. These questions were prominently discussed in the feminist movement, but not that much was being said about the young woman's quest for a kind of different individual feminist life. And so to an extent, Unlimited Girls really explored all those things. I too was a young woman at that time, right? I was like 30 years old. So I was curious and interested in all of these things. And so I think Unlimited Girls try to integrate into the ongoing feminist discussion questions about this kind of individual feminist life alongside the larger structural questions of feminism. 25 years later, I've been running Agents of Ishq for 10 years. In December, it will be 10 years since we began Agents of Ishq. A lot has changed, but I definitely had begun to feel for the last 3 or 4 years that all the conversation about feminism seems to be limited to this very tiny subset of people who are online, who are English speaking and who are elites, that there is a disproportionate emphasis on the individual life. I mean, personal life and individual desire is always an important subject matter for feminism. But it had begun to overwhelm the discussion with how I felt. And questions of labor, questions of class were not entering the conversation as much as they needed to. The second thing is that because so much of conversation happens online, the idea of solidarity with other kinds of people is not sufficiently there. I mean, it's there in a notional or a discursive way, but just a kind of on-ground learning of other groups, how you can work with them. Just that imagination is very little for young people right now. And so actually when the Laws of Social Reproduction invited me to make the film, I felt excited that it was a chance to try to do something that would reintegrate these themes into that kind of a conversation and make people think about these ideas, write about these ideas. I mean, one hopes that journalists and influencers and students and others will watch the film, learn about the themes, look into the project, and maybe do their own work differently in the coming years. Yeah. So actually, Unlimited Girls to Working Girls is a kind of 25-year journey also of the conversations around feminism that have been going on, right? And I think another thing that you may not have noticed in Working Girls is that there's nothing in the north. The film is almost totally shot in other parts of the country except North India. Because I feel that's also a kind of imbalance, that we are always talking about the north. And we learn very little from other parts of the country. So it also felt like a nice way to see it's a big world, right? We're all part of this very big world, and there's a lot of other spaces to know about and learn from.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. And you've actually come back to directing documentaries almost after 14 years. That is a long time to be away from the industry. Do you think the industry has changed from when you last made a documentary? Especially with documentaries like Elephant Whisperers gaining like global recognition. Do you see India's documentary landscape, film landscape changing? And do you think AI, because it's a new technology, do you think it'll have a role to play in the coming years?
So, I mean, you're really asking two different questions, so I'll answer them separately. Has the landscape changed in the last few years? So, one way of looking at it is that there's an international recognition and people know that Indians make documentaries. Wow. And then they go to some international festivals and get awards. And I guess that's a good thing. There's nothing bad about that. But I think there's a flip side to it, which is that I do feel that in the late 90s and early 2000s, when digital technology especially came in, and it made it possible for more people to make films, there was a kind of sudden explosion of different voices, different styles of documentary, different approaches. And it was a tremendously exciting and fertile and creative time in what was happening with Indian documentary, right? So I would say that there were a number of filmmakers who had very distinctive styles, and that these different styles actually generated a new Indian audience for documentaries. So that there were people making films for here, to engage the local audience. But I think in the last 15, 20 years, there's a kind of sanitizing, a homogenizing of the documentary form that has come about. It's very much determined by, foreign funding or OTT platforms, and this kind of like very mixed voices, like that kind of unique artistic voice that somebody might have, or distinctive political approach that somebody might bring to their filmmaking. A lot of that has kind of been ironed out, and it's not very easy to tell one filmmaker from another filmmaker, right? So like stylistically, you may hear the topics, but you don't really, the filmmaker themselves shaping the film, you don't see that much. So in some ways, I think of it as, in the old days, people would always complain about films division films being government mouthpiece and they all look the same. And that's an arguable point and not for our current conversation. It's debatable. But nevertheless, I feel that there's a kind of industrial approach now that is very much determined by a kind of international. But when you say international, what do you really mean? You don't mean China or Japan or Vietnam. You always mean the US or Europe, right? So the kind of Western Anglophone world determines the way that those films should look and be. So I always feel a little bit like there's a lost opportunity in making films that are for local audiences, building local audiences, having documentary be as vibrant as it was in the late 90s and early 2000s. Of course, yes, there wasn't a lot of money. And because of digital technology, people were quickly trying to make things differently. Now, those kinds of films that are internationally supported get a lot of good funding. So I suppose that's a good thing for those filmmakers. But whether it's exciting for the documentary form, I'm not so convinced. How will AI change? AI will change what all of us do, right? I mean, it's the new technology. It has its exciting possibilities and it has its unsettling possibilities. It's unsettling because AI is already pre-controlled by corporates. See, when digital technology came, it was not that controlled by corporates. For example, Sony used to make a set of cameras that were called prosumer. They were in between professional and consumer, and that's what a lot of us could afford to buy and use, right? But today, what you're having is that when the new technology comes in, it comes pre-owned and preloaded with a kind of corporate intent. So what will that mean for AI and how AI impacts our lives is something that we are living out now and will learn. At the same time, I think, all new technologies, they provide a lot of new creative options. So it will be interesting to see what people do. And, I'm open and interested, even while I'm aware of all the surrounding frameworks of AI.
What's next for you? Are you working on any new projects that you can tell us about? And do they connect to the current landscape somehow?
Well, I mean, right now, just a few things that I'm not so ready to talk about. But certainly, because we are starting something new at Agents of Ishq called Poetic Politics, which are going to be an invitation to think more reflectively and outside binaries about life, politics, and so on and so forth. And because we'll be 10 years old in December, we will have some kind of an event to mark that. Agents of Ishq books are going to come out. So a lot of actually the work of the last 10 years in some ways is being consolidated and completed right now. And then next year I will do some new things.
That's great to hear. Once again, thank you so much for taking the time out to join us for Frontline Conversations. It was a lovely time to spend with you.